Hello all, thanks for dropping into our parent webinar. Today our topic is 4 ways to resolve family conflict. This webinar is brought to you by Outback Futures and the Resilient Kids and Youth Project. I'm Wendy Philpotts, the Region Lead for Winton, and with me is Dr. Gavin Brown, Clinical Psychologist and Gottman Certified Therapist. Gavin works for Outback Futures as part of the Barcaldine team. Hello, Gavin.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Gavin. Today we're going to discuss the topic of family conflict and look at 4 ways to resolve family conflict. Gavin, am I right in assuming that most families will experience conflict at some point?
Yes, absolutely, Wendy. Conflict is just one of those things that it's an inevitable part of life. We can't avoid it, no matter how hard we try. And so it's really, really important to be able to learn how to resolve that effectively, especially as parents. We want to be able to teach our children and our young people how to resolve conflict effectively, because that's really kind of a key thing that sets them up for healthy relationships in the future.
Okay, so you're saying that we can learn how to deal with conflict in a healthy way and teach our kids how to do that too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. Unfortunately, we see kind of lots of examples in the media and such of conflict not being handled in a healthy way. So there are definitely little tips and tricks and ways that we can approach it that are going to help us to be able to do that in a healthy manner.
Okay, that sounds something that could be very, very helpful and relevant to all families. So what tips do you have for us in dealing with conflict in a healthy way, Gavin?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the first tips and maybe one of the most important is really about the importance of what psychologists might call co-regulation, which is kind of this idea that I help you to be able to manage yourself. When we talk about regulation, we're talking about managing emotions. And so co-regulation is the idea that particularly for parents, that as parents, we help our children and our young people to be able to regulate their emotion. But when we talk about co-regulation, really what we're talking about is the fact that we each have to kind of help each other to regulate. And so a really important part of that is that as parents, that we're really mindful and paying attention to our own feelings and our own kind of beliefs and attitudes about conflict. So really, it's this idea that in conflict, we need to remain calm. And I know that's kind of much easier said than done lots of times, especially with little kids. But it's so important because there's a really kind of simple truth in that you can't give away what you don't have. So sometimes as parents, if we're not managing ourselves well, if we don't have some kind of semblance of calm about us, it's really, really hard to then help your child to be able to go to that place themselves. And so that's the co-regulation, is my calmness is going to help you to be calm. And so it's really important, particularly for young kids, because young kids have almost no ability to do this. And that's kind of just part of their development, that they're not able to regulate. And so how we are with kids, especially in conflict, helps them to learn those skills by modeling it for them. And I guess when we think about being calm, what that also means is we need to think about, well, how are we going to approach a particular conflict? Because, maybe now is not the time, in terms of if I'm not feeling okay, then this may not be the best time to approach conflict. Similarly, if my child is not feeling okay, then this also may not be the best time. We've all got to learn, as I've had to learn with my kids sometimes in the kind of tantrum or explosion or whatever, and they might storm off to their room and slam the door or whatever, as kids do. And it's really about being able to go, okay, is it actually going to be effective for me to kind of go after them right now and try and talk about what happened? Or do I actually need to wait? Do I actually need to regulate myself because maybe I'm not feeling okay after that conflict? But do I also need to give them some time and space where they can begin to regulate themselves as well? So I guess part of this co-regulation is thinking about when is the time to do this? What's important right now that I want to help my child or my teenager to achieve a sense of calm first, and then potentially address things later on. I guess one of the things that can be helpful for us in terms of that co-regulation is really any form of sort of mindfulness or being present, as we sometimes talk about it. So that can be really helpful, just to be in the present moment, to not get caught up in necessarily what just happened in that kind of fight between maybe us or our kids, or of course us and our partners as well. But to be able to just be in that present moment and be mindful about what's going on for us. And there are heaps of different ways to do that. There are lots of breathing exercises, what we call grounding exercises, things like that. But there's also cool ways, like if for some people that maybe are out on properties and things like that, there are some animals that are really great at helping us to co-regulate. So dogs help a little bit. So, when you're not feeling great, you pat your dog and you feel a little bit better. Horses actually are really, really effective at helping people to co-regulate. Horses have a exceptional ability to be able to understand what's going on with humans and their emotions. So, this is maybe a different way to think about co-regulation, is potentially, sending your kids or taking yourself out to interact with some of the animals on your property, if you're lucky enough to have that, just as a way of being able to kind of turn down that emotional pressure for you. So, but it's really important to remember that I need to be calm. If I'm not calm, I'm actually not going to achieve anything really helpful beyond this point.
Okay, so we need to keep calm as parents. That will help our children, and maybe, take some time to calm down before dealing with something later, and thinking about the timing of discussing a difficult topic. Okay, so tell me more, Gavin.
Yeah, so I think another important thing to think about, and lots of kind of conflict resolution focuses on this idea about it's the way that you communicate and all this kind of thing, and obviously that's important, but really, for most of us, we know how to communicate. We actually do it all day, every day. We communicate with other people. So, while that can be important, I actually think there's other kind of deeper things to think about in terms of how to manage conflict. And one of those would be thinking about what is the source of this conflict that we're dealing with? Where does it kind of really come from? And there's a few different kind of ways to look at this. So one is in terms of actually what's happening in our brain. So there's a psychologist by the name of Dan Siegel who's written some incredible books around children's brain development. And one of the things that he talks about is what's called a top-down versus a bottom-up tantrum in children, and how do we deal with that? So thinking about the source, as in where is this coming from? What that actually means, the kind of top-down or bottom-up, is if you think of your brain as kind of, if I can try and represent it here for us, if you think of the lower parts of the brain represented here by my fist, the lower parts of the brain are where really the emotional centers of the brain are kind of kept. The higher parts of the brain are more our sort of thinking or rational structures, if you like. And so a brain actually kind of looks like that the higher parts of the brain actually cover the emotional parts of the brain. And so Dan Siegel talks about this idea of top-down versus bottom-up. What he means by bottom-up is an emotion-driven kind of tantrum or outburst from a child. And that might be something like, if they're really tired. I mean, we all know what kids get like sometimes when they're really exhausted and they're just over it, and they're kind of driven by their emotions. And what he really talks about is that in that kind of sort of upset or outburst for a young child, what we want to do is to be able to, as we're talking about, help them to co-regulate. We need to help them to kind of turn down the emotional centers of the brain so that our rational centers can kind of come back in and take over a little bit. So that's a bottom-up tantrum. So it's recognizing this person is really emotional right now. What they actually need is kind of some support around that in terms of managing those emotions. When he talks about top-down kind of tantrum, what he's actually talking about is a tantrum or an outburst, if you like, that comes from the higher parts of the brain. So in other words, this is when our darling little children become really, really calculated about things. So it's really where kids are kind of trying to push the boundaries quite intentionally. And one of the things that Dan Siegel talks about is when it's a top-down sort of tantrum or outburst, that's actually when we need to have really healthy boundaries. So, that's where we might be talking about kind of consequences for behaviour relatively quickly. We wouldn't want to do that with a bottom-up tantrum or an emotionally driven tantrum, because a child wouldn't necessarily be able to process that at that point. They're driven by their emotions. They're not thinking, in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing the difference between those kind of two sources, if you like, is really important, because it actually tells us what's the most helpful thing to do then as parents. Do I actually seek to kind of help my child be okay and to process some big emotions? Or actually, do I need to kind of put some boundaries in place? So that's kind of one way of thinking about the source of a conflict, is which part of the brain does it come from? But I guess it's also, one of the other things that I think is really important is thinking about where is this conflict really coming from, in terms of, am I the intended target, if you like, of this conflict? So for some kids, and especially kids that maybe have sort of learning difficulties or some developmental delays, if you think about the school environment, that environment often takes a lot of resources for a child to be able to function in. There's kind of lots of expectations at school. You can't just go and do whatever you want. You have to do, what the teacher says, and you have to try to behave fairly well. And so the thing is, for some kids, that's a really big effort. It takes a lot to be able to kind of, hold your emotions in check and do the right thing for 6 hours a day. And so sometimes what you see is kind of, kids that come home and sort of explode and are bouncing off the walls and all that kind of thing. And so sometimes it's important to recognize that even though maybe I'm kind of bearing the brunt of my child's emotions right now, and there's conflict happening, maybe I'm not the source. Maybe actually what this is about is my child's had to hold it together for a really long time to be able to function in the world. And actually what they're now doing is kind of letting go of some of that pressure in a place that's safe. And so that can be a tricky thing for parents sometimes to actually understand. That is, sometimes we see the worst behavior from our kids because we are, hopefully, the safest people in their life. So it's kind of, I can lose my head in this environment because I know it's going to be okay in the end. And so really important to think about, is this where the conflict is coming from, or is it actually something else? Similarly, for us as adults, it's, thinking about that. Maybe I've had a really bad day at work and I had to deal with my boss who drove me crazy, and I come home and I want to kind of kick the cat, not because I'm actually upset with the cat, but because there's a conflict from somewhere else that's just getting played out here. And so it is useful sometimes, I think, in a family context to think about, well, is this really what the conflict is about? Or is it actually from somewhere else, which hopefully helps us to be a little bit more patient with everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. So you've mentioned keeping calm, that co-regulation. You've mentioned just really looking to see what the source of the conflict is, whether it's that emotional part of the brain or whether it's a more calculated thinking part of the brain pushing the boundaries, and also whether it's even coming from other external things like the child being at school and dealing with various pressures, whether that be in the school, I guess, situation, or whether it's, from peers at school. So what's the next tip that you can give, or the next step that we might consider in terms of dealing with family conflict, Gavin?
Yeah, so I think one of the important things, and I think sometimes this gets missed in a lot of our conflict resolution work, is the idea of being able to identify needs. So, John Gottman, who's a psychologist and researcher in the area of relationships in particular, he talks about this idea that beneath every conflict is a longing. There's actually, under conflict, there's something important for somebody, and we need to actually be able to recognize that. There's another psychologist, Susan David, who I think is from Harvard University, who talks about, she talks a lot about emotions and being able to kind of work with emotions. And she talks about the idea that often when we're angry, a big part of the reason why we're angry sometimes is because something that's important to me is threatened in some way. And the danger is that if all we ever see is anger, we kind of respond to that in unhelpful ways. And so the ability to actually kind of step back and think about what's really going on here. I think a really powerful question that we can ask in conflict sometimes, which really you can only ask if you've managed to regulate yourself and maintain that calm, is to be able to ask someone, what do you actually need? What is it that you need here? Because that doesn't always get expressed in conflict, particularly if we're not used to doing it in a healthy way. Sometimes there can be lots of emotion, maybe things said that aren't helpful, behaviors that aren't helpful. But what we often don't see is what do you actually need here, and can we see kind of the deeper purpose? And I guess like an example of what I'm talking about is not that long ago, my son, who's just about to become a teenager in a couple of weeks, he got a mobile phone, partly because the school they go to is a bit of a distance away, and so it's good for him to have that communication. But what that has predictably led to, or at least maybe I should have seen this at the start, was a fair bit of conflict around his use of that phone and what's kind of acceptable. And this might be a conflict that lots of parents are used to in their home in this day and age around things like technology. So what we're talking about here in terms of the deeper longing is when I'm engaged with him in those sort of discussions about what's an appropriate use of his phone and how long should he be using it for, what I'm kind of seeing is, technology and, my I guess kind of fear that that will sort of take over his life. He'll end up with some technology addiction, all that kind of thing. But one of the things that we've got to recognize in this day and age, I think particularly for young people, and especially where maybe they are in a bit more of a remote situation, like there aren't neighbors just kind of next door, is that, for my son, that phone, that technology actually represents connection, that it's his way of connecting with his friends at school who, live in various different places and can't easily interact. And so the thing is, if I want to have this kind of big argument with him about what's appropriate in technology, and that's kind of the level that we keep it at, then what I'm never going to see is that actually when he's fighting with me about that, that potentially what he's fighting for is I need to have a sense of connection with my peers, which is really, really important for teenagers, obviously. So it's about being able to look underneath an argument to find out what is really going on here, potentially for all of us, but that often there are really, really important things that we can't easily let go of. And so sometimes that might be why we kind of fight quite passionately for something, because there's something here that's really important to me. I also think, in general, talking about kind of the teenage end, that as kids get older, one of the things that's really important is to help teenagers in particular to be able to negotiate about things. So moving from that kind of hard and fast rule, if you like, that we might have when kids are younger and maybe aren't yet ready to make good choices for themselves, but to move that to a place where teenagers have a bit of autonomy, and what they actually learn is how to negotiate, because that's a really important skill in terms of adult relationships. Is I need to be able to negotiate what I need and to try and balance it with what you need as well. So helping teenagers to do that is a really important part of their development. And it also helps them to identify what is it that I need as well, because they may not necessarily be aware of that at the time, especially if you're engaged in conflict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess as parents, we've just got to pause sometimes, maybe to think about what on earth is going on at a deeper level. What is the need? And asking that question, what do you need? Okay. And point forward, Gavin, keep going. We're finding this really helpful and really interesting.
Yeah, so I think one of the other things that's really important about being able to manage conflict is that we need to actually learn how to apologize. And I think it's actually a really important skill. It might be surprising to kind of hear that when in my private practice, I do lots of work with couples. That's kind of mainly who I work with. And it might be surprising to hear that actually one of the things that I do sometimes is to help people to not apologize so quickly. So, what happens sometimes in conflict is if there's kind of a sense of conflict that, one partner might quickly jump in and sort of say, I'm sorry that happened or whatever. The problem is sometimes what actually drives that is if I apologize to you, then you're not allowed to talk about this anymore. And it's actually a form of defensiveness, which is not very helpful. And so when I talk about learning how to apologize, sometimes what we've got to do is actually delay our apology. And the reason why we want to do that is because if I'm going to apologize, I want to be able to apologize specifically. So rather than just kind of, I'm sorry, to actually be able to talk about, kind of what was happening for you in that conflict, or, what was the thing that really didn't go okay for you in that conflict. And sometimes it's about recognizing it might be, the way that you spoke to me. Not necessarily the things that you said. The things that you said actually were probably true, but it's the way that you said them. Or, you use this particular word, or maybe you called me a name or said something like that. So it's actually helpful to be able to learn how to apologize quite specifically for the thing that the other person needs to be apologized to, if that makes sense. So if I'm hurt because, my child has sort of, wheeled out that age-old thread about, I hate you kind of thing, I want you to apologize for saying that bit. I can understand that maybe you were upset, that maybe you are, angry about not being able to get what you need. I can understand that, but I want you to apologize for saying that awful thing. So in that sense, it's really being able to kind of laser focus our apology, which I think, in my experience, actually makes it so much more powerful. And unfortunately, to some degree, kind of in this day and age, we've actually got to learn what an apology looks like. Because things like, which I sometimes hear from some of my couples, things like, I'm sorry you felt that way, that is not an apology. You know, that's not actually saying, here's something that I did that was not helpful to you. And what we've also got to learn is that you don't need to apologize for every single thing. It's the parts that matter. You know, it's the parts that really hurt the person that we're interacting with that are important.
Gavin, it can be hard to say sorry sometimes. How can we overcome this?
It can be hard to say sorry. For some people, it's like, I don't know, sucking lemon juice or something. And I think one of the reasons why that is because ultimately no one likes to be wrong. Okay, we don't actually enjoy that. We don't enjoy the idea that I did something that maybe hurt someone that I care about, or that wasn't helpful. And so unfortunately what happens sometimes is if we kind of have to be in that position, what can come up for us sometimes is a lot of shame. And so we want to be able to help, especially kids and teenagers, to apologize in a way that doesn't shame them, that doesn't kind of, you know, chip away at their self-esteem as, you know, you are wrong. When we talk about the emotion of shame, shame predominantly sends us this message about I am wrong instead of I have done something wrong. I have done something wrong most of us can deal with. I am wrong is a really powerful and quite destructive message. And so that's part of why I think sometimes people really struggle to apologize, is because they maybe have a sense of shame. And it's actually, it's kind of being able to demonstrate to people that when you apologize, I give you kind of, you know, grace and patience and forgiveness about that. Yeah, it's really important that that's the dynamic around apologizing, so that people feel like they can do it, and it's not something that's going to be detrimental to my image of myself.
So, Gavin, to recap what we've discussed today, you've talked firstly about co-regulation, keeping calm. Tip 2 being finding the source of the conflict, and you just discussed top-down and bottom-up tantrums. Tip 3 was to identify the needs, thinking through the question, what do you need, and helping our child or teenager to negotiate. And tip 4, learning how to apologise. Gavin, that's quite a lot of food for thought for us. Thank you so much. There's been some great helpful tips in there today. Should any of our audience want to dive deeper, are there any other resources that you can recommend?
Yeah, I think so. There is the Gottman website has a blog that has, excuse me, has lots of information around relationships and parenting, and some really good kind of universal tips about managing conflict, which is really helpful. But also, you know, all of the usual sources. I think there's some stuff on the Beyond Blue website. Things like that, any kind of child development work. In terms of, in terms of children in general, there's a few kind of authors and people that have websites with various resources. Andrew Fuller is a psychologist, an Australian psychologist, who has some great websites, great resources on his website. And of course, people like Maggie Dent and Steve Bidoff, who've written a lot of books around kids and teenagers, and would also have some really great tips and ideas about how to manage family conflict.
And I believe you can find more helpful tips and resources on our Outback Futures website, outbackfutures.org.au. And if families feel stuck, can they reach out for specific support?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, in my line of work, especially working with couples, I deal with lots and lots of conflict all the time. So, reaching out to a counsellor or a psychologist can be really helpful. And I think, as I said, I think it's important to do that if you realise that conflict is becoming destructive in your family, because it really is about that we're, as parents, we're setting our children up for how they will function in their future relationships. And so giving kids a clear message about that actually conflict is okay. It's okay to have conflict, because that just happens. We all have different wants and needs, and sometimes they don't actually match. So it's okay to have conflict. You've just got to be able to do that in a healthy and safe way that actually promotes connection in relationships rather than disconnection and disharmony in families.
So a very important skill to learn, really.
Yeah.
For regions supported by Outback Futures, they can always reach out to connect with an Outback Futures team member. Well, Gavin, it's been my absolute pleasure to be discussing such an important topic today.
Thanks,
it's one that we all face at some point, and these tips can really help to set us up to deal with conflict in a very healthy way, so that we can be modelling and teaching our kids healthy conflict resolution. So thanks so much, Gavin, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye.